Today we'll be discussing, I think, on the surface, perhaps humorous idea in the Gemara. But as we'll try to understand and explore, it could be hiding something a lot more profound and meaningful that actually bears a lot of relevance to our lives. We've been discussing a lot of things relating to the relationship between men and women and marriage. That's the sugya in general that we've been revolving around. Dapim Samech Chalaf through Samech Hey, there's a lot of agadat around that stuff. So here we're going to explore a teaching that's found in our Gemara, and then we'll see it's expanded on in Brachot as well. We'll see how different Mefarshim understand it. But let's just read it inside. Maybe some of you are familiar with it, but it's kind of a funny concept. So, the Gemara in Yevamot on Daf Samech Gimel Amud Bet teaches as follows. Amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, Kevan shenasa Adam isha avonotav mitpakekim, shneemar matza isha matza tov, v'yapek ratzon meHashem. Okay, so Rabbi Chama teaches that once a man gets married, his sins become, according to Rashi, this means stopped up, like a plug or a cork. As the pasuk says, when a person finds a woman, he finds goodness, and he finds favor from God, but it's a play on words of the yapek to be kind of stopped up. So the Mefarshim explained that means that it's in a very literal sense that when you don't have a wife as a man, so you have certain urges that you can't fulfill in a kosher or holy way, and then once you get married, you're able to do it in a way that's permitted, and so your sins get stopped up. And then the Gemara continues and says, B'ma'arava, but in Eretz Yisrael, in the West, Kinesiv inish itata amrile hachimatza o motze. So when a man would get married in the West, in Eretz Yisrael, when a groom would marry a bride, so he would ask the groom, they would say, so is this one, is the girl, is she a matzah or motze, the girl that you're marrying? So what does that mean? So matzah dichtiv matzah isha matzah tov, right? Matzah as in matzah, you found a good one, or you bagged a good one. Or motze, as it says in Kohelet, umotze ani mar mimavet et haisha, right? I found something more bitter than death, which is woman. So they ask the groom on his wedding day, they say, is this a matzah or motze? Did you find greatness, or did you find something more bitter than death? Right, so on the surface, I think, you could take this as just to be kind of the friends of the groom messing around with him and saying, like, ball and chain, or, like, what's going on? Did you get, is she a keeper, or is she just gonna, whatever. It could be that there's kind of humor behind this idea. But obviously, it stands to reason that there's something much deeper going on as well behind the question of matzah or motze, that they would ask the groom, is your bride a matzah isha matzah tov, or motze ani mar mavet et isha? So before we start looking at the sources, I want to just kind of ask a question, see if anyone has any ideas. If you just look at these two psukim of matzah isha matzah tov on the one hand, and then motze ani mar mimavet et isha, what differences do you see between the psukim? And we'll tie into this at the end. In terms of the structure of the psukim and how the word order and all that, what are the differences between this on the one hand and then this on the other hand? Not everybody at once.
There's a tense difference, no? Matzah is found, motze is finding.
Mm-hmm.
Or
good.
Find present.
Yep. Right. Good. That's a good one. Mm-hmm. What else? Anything else?
The second one mentions ani. The first one is implied, I guess, but the second one is explicitly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The first one says you find a wife, and the second one says I find a wife. Right? Or a woman. Good. There's one more interesting one, I think. So here it says matzah isha, and here it says et haisha. Right? The wife versus wife. There's those three ideas of, is it past tense, present tense? Is the first person inserted in the middle, and then is she kind of referred to as a definite with the definite article hey, or just woman in general. So we'll try in the end to develop an idea based on kind of all those to see why perhaps those could be interesting. First, let's look at where else this idea of what they used to say in the West comes up. So there's a Gemara in Brachot and Daf Cher Amud Bet, which attempts to understand a famous pasuk from Tehillim. It says as follows: Al zot yitpalel kol chasid elecha le'et mitzo. So this pasuk is the classic prayer of a chassid, right? It says, "This is what a chassid will pray for le'et mitzo, in the time of finding, when God is to be found." And then the pasuk continues and says, "Rak b'shetef mayim rabim elav lo yagiu," that he won't be overwhelmed by these raging waters, right? The chassid prays to God when God is available to him, that he won't be overwhelmed by this flood of waters. So what is this referring to? So the first opinion is Amar B'Chanina. B'Chanina says, L'eit mitzo zo isha, shene'emar matzah isha matzah tov. So when it says L'eit mitzo, the reference is to a woman, as it says matzah isha matzah tov. And then he continues to Marav Kinasiv Inash Iteta Amri Lehachi Matzah Motze Matzah Dichtiv Matzah Isha Matzah Tov Motze Dichtiv Matzah Nimar V'Tisha V'Gomer. And then he quotes our idea. So just to continue the Gemara, it gives other approaches as well of what this is a reference to. Rabbi Natan Omer Leit Mitzvah Zu Torah. Okay, he quotes a pasuk. Rav Nachman Ritzchak says Leit Mitzvah Zu Mita, right, death. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Leit Mitzvah Zu Kfura, burial. Mar Zutra Amar Leit Mitzvah Zu Beit HaKisei, is going to the bathroom. V'Amri B'Ma'arava, and then Eretz Yisrael they said Haida Mar Zutra Adifa Mikulu, that the best answer is actually Mar Zutras of the bathroom. Because what's going on here? So what is a chassid praying for in a time of need to God? That he shouldn't be overwhelmed by the waters. So according to Rabbi Chanina, which is one that interests us, where it says Leit Mitzo Zuisha, so he's understanding Mitzo in the sense that Matzah is a shorish that a lot of times has to do with a wife. Right? We saw Matzah Isha Matzah Tov, Motze Nimam Avad Isha, but also the first time it ever comes up in the Torah is when Adam is in the Garden of Eden, in Gan Eden, and then we're told Lo Matzah Ezer Kenegdo, right? That Adam didn't have a mate. He couldn't find someone to complement him, to complete him. And so the first time Matzah comes up is in reference to finding a spouse. It's the paradigmatic example of finding your significant other who completes you. That is the ultimate find. So perhaps Rabbi Chanina is picking up on that when he says Leit Mitzvah is referring to a woman. But the idea here as well is the second half of the pasuk, which says that the chassid's praying he shouldn't be overwhelmed by raging waters. So that's interpreted by each of these rabbis in different ways. But for Rabbi Chanina, at least according to Rashi, the idea is what we saw before, which is that the raging waters here that could overwhelm him is the temptation, the urges that a man has. And if he finds a wife, so then those won't overwhelm him because he'll have a way to conduct himself in a holy fashion, in a way that he maintains his chassidut as opposed to slipping into sin. So that's the Gemara in Brachot. Let's look now at a couple of mefarshim which have elaborate on these Gemaras. So first I want to look at just the Gemara in Brachot specifically, to see a couple of things that the Mefarshim there say. So the Eitz Yosef says the idea that I just said outside, but we can just look at it inside, that what is Rabbi Chanina trying to teach? So it says, Ubidrash zeh mevuar sofa pasuk, rak b'shetef mayim rabim elav lo yagiu. So al da'at ma'amar Chazal, this is based on the teaching of Chazal, da'inu shemitzilot otanu min hachet, ki below isha, bizmano mitgaber, Alav hayetzer hara v'yireh kerev yishpoch zaro keshetef mayim le'onso. Right, that there's this teaching that among many other things, the benefit of being married is that it saves us men from sin, and the idea being that if you go a long time without being able to fulfill that desire, that need, so then the yetzer hara is able to overtake you, and you become kind of an onus to it, and you spill the overwhelming seed, and that's how it's interpreting that pasuk. Okay, it says also in Eruvin that the 130 years, Shepirish Adam Arishon Mina Isha, that Adam Arishon separated from Chava for 130 years, Nishpach Shichvat Zera L'Onso V'Yolid Ruchin V'Shedin V'Gomer, that he spilled a lot of seed and he created all sorts of demons and spirits, etc. In other words, there's a negative connotation to spilling seed, and so being married allows you to do that in a way that doesn't create, demons, etc. And so that's kind of the idea behind how he understands that teaching of Rabbi Chanina. If we look at the Anaf Yosef, so he says something interesting as well. So he says, "B'ma'arava ki nasiv l'chu matzah or motze." So he now is trying to understand the teaching of matzah or motze. And his question is a rather specific question. He says, "Kasher lama shalu zot hashela dafka be'eretz Yisrael v'lo b'chutz la'aretz." Like, why is it, in Eretz Yisrael they used to ask the groom, is this a matzah or motze? What, they didn't ask that in Bavel? Like, what's the significance of asking it in Eretz Yisrael? V'yesh lomar ki be'gemar maksheh shepam achat amru sharba'im yom. I think the rest of the source got cut off here. I didn't bring the rest of the source, but I'll say it outside. That basically, the Gemara in Sota says that there's two teachings that are contradictory. One says that 40 days before a person's born, a bat kol goes out and says, this person is going to marry this other person. Right? The whole idea of a shidduch and basheret is that, right, that we're predestined to find our wives. But then there's another Gemara that says a man merits to marry a wife based on his own deeds, his own acts. So the more righteous he is, the more likely he is to find someone righteous. So the Gemara says, how do you make those two work together? So the answer the Gemara gives is that the first one is referring to a first wife, and the second one is referring to the second wife. That a first wife is basher, but the second wife is based on your qualifications, as it were. But the Anaf Yosef quotes, he says, the Mikubalim teach something different. They say that in Kabbalah, the Kabbalists teach that the first one is about Eretz Yisrael, and the second one is about Chutz La'aretz. That in Eretz Yisrael, a person, if someone is in Eretz Yisrael, so then the marriage is min hashamayim, it's predestined. But in Chutz La'aretz, it's based on his own actions. So then Anaf Yosef says, okay, leaving aside how to understand that idea of the Mikubalim, that explains why this teaching is only in Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because in Eretz Yisrael, you can ask a groom, matzah or motze, is she great or is she more bitter than death? Because it's a gzera from min hashamayim. It's a bat kol that went out before you were born. So it's nothing to do with you. So it's okay to ask him what kind of wife he ended up being able to marry. But in Chutz La'aretz, you can't ask him matzah or motze, because in Chutz La'aretz, according to the Mikubalim, who a man marries is based on his own merit. So if you're asking matzah or motze, you're basically, the answer is going to tell you, it's going to embarrass the groom, or say something negative about the groom, that if he has a motze, that means something bad about him. So we don't want to ask him in Chutz La'aretz, but we feel comfortable asking in Eretz Yisrael, which is why it's only b'ma'arava. That was kind of a cute idea. The Maharsha is also elaborates a bit on this idea of matzah or motze, and also has a teaching on it, which might not be so politically correct in today's day and age. But we'll see what he says. Okay, so he says matzah or motze. So matzah karei al ish shematzah lo isha tova ra'ui lismoch ba kilu matzah mitziya. Right? Why does it say matzah isha matzah tov? Because a man who merits to have a good wife, so he should be happy as though he found this great treasure. Right? Aval bishara lo ka'amar matzah ish ki'ena mitziya lo. Aval amar shlomo motze nimar ma'amavet isha. Fine. Hamyuchedet liot moshelet alav. So the Maharsha says, what does it mean, a woman who's wicked? So it means Isha miyuchedet liot moshelet alav, a woman who rules over her husband, who wears the pants, as it were. And then he quotes this Gemara in Bava Metzia, which I actually brought down here, which there's a teaching in Bava Metzia, which says, Tanu Rabbanan shlosha tzoakin ve'enan ne'anin. There's three categories of people who cry out, and there's no one to answer them. Ve'eluhen, these are they. Mishi yesh lo ma'ot u'malveotan shelo beidim. Someone who has money, lends it to someone else, but doesn't do it in front of witnesses, and then he goes to court and tries to get the money back, but there's no witnesses, so he can't get it back. Ve'koneh adon latzmo, and then someone who has to sell himself into slavery. U'mishi ishto moshelet alav, and someone whose wife rules over him. So he falls under the category of 3 that cry out and are not answered. So the Maharsha says, in his opinion, this is what it means, Yishar, that the woman rules over him. And he has a teaching on this. It says, V'remes ha'isha gematria ish. So if you take the word, Mוצא אני ממר מוות et ha'isha, so the word ha'isha in gematria is the same as ish, because the 2 hays equal the yud. So it's shehi bimkom ish. She's like a man. The woman who is bitterer than death is ha'isha, the woman, who is equal to ish. In other words, she is acting like the man, so she is more bitter than death, because she rules over him. Right? But v'sem b'isha tova matzatov, but the good wife is just isha, not ha'isha. So it's just isha, shehi isha, because when she's a woman, she doesn't act like she doesn't rule over him. So then he merited a good wife. Vu'ish k'mo she'amar vu'im shalbach, right? Because it says when Chava is punished at the end of Gan Eden, so right, the punishment, the idea is that the man should rule over the woman. Etc. Etc. Okay, so that's the Maharsha's idea. He has a little gematria.
What's the Maharsha Shita on Shalom Bayis?
What's the Maharsha Shita on Shalom Bayis? So I think the answer we're going to give now, not in line with Maharsha, is perhaps an answer that it sits better with us in today's day and age for sure, on how to interpret this whole thing. But I did want to bring his opinion because I thought he had an interesting gematria, which is picking up on the nuance of Ha'isha versus Isha, and that he quotes the Gemara of Mutza, so that's kind of his opinion on how to understand what a wicked woman is, a woman who rules over him. And then the Gemara says that the husband is someone who cries out and it's not answered. He falls into that category if his woman rules over him. Okay. I want to now... How much time do we have left? 10 minutes. Good. Okay, let's look at a couple of other Gemaras, and then I'll try to give this I think, way to understand this idea. So the Gemara on Chulin Adaf Pei Dal Amud Bet has the following teaching. Darash Rav Avira. Zimnin Amar La Mishmeder Bi'ami, Zimnin Amar La Mishmeder Bi'asi. Okay, so the teaching depends who you ask. There's different traditions of who taught it. My dichtiv, why does the pasuk say, Tov ish chonenu malvei chalkel dvarav b'mishpat? So that means, L'olam yochal adam v'yishteh pachot mima sheyesh lo. A person should eat and drink less than his means allow. In other words, that he could afford more or fancier food, he should eat less than that. V'yitkaseh b'ma sheyesh lo. He should dress based on what his means allow. He should dress according to what he can afford. V'yichaber ishto uvanav yoter mima sheyesh lo. But he should honor his wife and his children more than what his means allow. Shehen tluyin bo v'u tluy b'mi she'amar v'ya olam. Because his wife and children are dependent on him, and he is dependent in terms of his parnasah on the one who spoke the world into existence, in other words, God. So here you have, I think, this nice idea that says you have a certain amount of money. What is the right way to spend it, both in terms of your own financial planning and in terms of how you're perceived, how you want yourself to be perceived to the outside world. So you should dress according to your means. If you have the money, you shouldn't wear rags, right? You should dress appropriately based on your status in society. But you should always eat less than what you could. You shouldn't eat like a pig. You should make sure that you are frugal in terms of how you conduct yourself in terms of food. But you should make sure to go above and beyond what you should really be able to do in terms of honoring your wife and your family. So that's a nice teaching in Chulin. Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer has a teaching as well, which will relate to our final thought. In Perek Membet, it teaches as follows. Rabbi Reuven Omer, Hakol olech acha harosh. He says everything goes after the head. So what does that mean, everything goes after the head? Ematai, when? Bizman shel ro'eh to'eh atzon to'in acharav. If the shepherd goes astray, then the sheep also go astray. Shnemar al chatat Yeravam ben Nevat asher chatav asher chtiet Yisrael. So the analogy is Yeravam ben Nevat was the shepherd, he was the head, he was the leader. He led Bnei Yisrael astray, because he went and he built these idols, and then the Malchut Yisrael went and sinned as well. Ve'ematai, but on the other hand, Bizman shel ro'eh tov, hatzon olchim acharav ve'olchim b'derech yishara. But when the shepherd is good, when the leader is good, he can lead the flock and the people on the right path. And what's the proof? Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom ro'eh ne'eman haya. because Moshe was a righteous shepherd. V'itchil l'shorer l'zamer lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'alchu kol Yisrael acharav shneimar az Yishem Moshe. He started to sing, and everybody followed him. Az Yishem Moshe v'nei Yisrael. So the idea being hakol olech harosh, that there are times when, that depending on who the leader is, the people follow after him. So let's try to tie together kind of the things that we've said until now. So this is an idea that I read in this book called The Mystery of Marriage by someone named Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg, who is this absolute genius. He's still alive. He's quite elderly, but he is completely knowledgeable in everything, all of Torah and all of the secular world, like philosophy, mathematics, physics, but also Kabbalah and Chassidut, and he has a very unique perspective on how everything ties together. So in this book of The Mystery of Marriage, so he says as follows. He says, and by the way, I didn't mention this, but the Rif, in his comments on our Gemara, says the basis for what Yitzchak Ginsburg elaborates on, but the Rif is rather long, so I'm not going to read it too much inside, but we'll just kind of read a couple lines of the Rif, and then I'll say outside where Yitzchak Ginsburg elaborates. The Rif basically says as follows. He says, there's a couple problems with this whole idea of matzah or motze. Right? He says, let me find it. Okay. So there's a problem with the question that in the West they would ask the groom matzah or motze. You have to understand their reasoning. You're going to ask a groom on his wedding night if he found a good wife or a bad wife. That's not something that a groom necessarily knows, right? That's something that becomes clear over time as he gets married and the honeymoon phase wears off and life progresses, right? So then there are things that become clear that when you're dating you don't necessarily know. So how are you supposed to ask a groom on his wedding if you found a good wife or a bad wife, whatever that means? So that's one question. He says, what are they adding by asking this question? If she's a good wife, so she's a good wife. Like, what does their question matter? And if she's a bad wife, he's at his wedding. Right? So, they'll just cause him to be stressed out about the fact that his wife is a motze. Like, what do they add? So basically, his idea is that this whole question is not about the wife. It's really about the groom. It's less about her than it is about him. And he explains as follows. And he says, really what's going on here is, v'zeh hadavar atzmo, הייתה כוונת בני מערבה, שהיו שואלים לחתן מצא ומוצא, כי היו רוצים להזהיר ולהדריך את החתן בדרך ישרה. Their goal is to give some life advice to the chassan before he starts his marriage, right? So they want to warn him and guide him in the right way. What does that mean? שלא ישוב עוד לקסלה. לכך היו אומרים, ראה נתתי לפניך שני דרכים, את החיים ואת הטוב ואת המוות ואת הרע. This is a pasuk from Nitzavim, where Moshe says to Bnei Yisrael that I have given to you two paths. And Moshe goes and elaborates and says Chaim is a life of Torah and mitzvot, and rejecting Torah and mitzvot and not listening to God is a life of mavet and ra. So the idea of like the ultimate pasuk that proves or says that Judaism believes in free will and choice is that you have a choice in life of Chaim and Tov or mavet and ra. And so the Rif here is saying that that's really what's going on with matzah and motzeh. Because yesh derech yashar lefanecha, v'az tekayem mikra shekatuv matzah isha, דהיינו, אם תשתדל למצוא חן ושכל טוב בעיני אלוהים ואדם, לשמור מצוותיו, ואז יתקיים בך סוף הפסוק, שנאמר ויפג מרצון מהשם. That matzah is really saying, are you going to, in your life, now you're getting married, right? You're building a house, you're becoming a man. So are you going to be the type of person that finds good now that you're married, in the sense that you're going to make sure that you are pleasant in the eyes of God and other men to keep the mitzvot and to be a decent person? Or are you going to be a motze, right? Are you going to be the type of person, and you maintain, you keep being wicked, that you become like more bitter than death, in terms that you're a disgusting person and that you don't treat other people nicely and you don't follow Torah mitzvot. And so he says that's really what's going on here. And he concludes and he says, right, they're not really, like the surface level understanding of this is not really what's going on here. Because you have to know that this is teaching something more profound. Because how could they ask a groom if he married a good wife or a bad wife when he's at his wedding? It doesn't make any sense. It must be teaching this deeper point about how there's two paths in life, and now that he's getting married, he has to understand that it's really on him to determine that. Rav Ginsburg takes it one step further, and he says, if we go back to the psukim themselves, we noted a few differences between them. Right? We noted that one, matzah is in the past tense, this is what Johnny said, and motzeh is in the present tense. So he says, really what matzah or motzeh is about the groom's attitude toward his marriage, toward his wife, and how he's approaching the relationship, the life that he's going to build with his spouse. Right? Does he see her as matzah isha, that he found her, that she's the one, right? That matzah, he found the one that's for him? Or is it motzeh, that he's finding? In other words, it's not something that like he saw her and he knew that she was the one for him, that she completes him, that she is what she's his bashert, as it were. Or is she just something that he's going to find along the way, that he's going to make do with, that he maybe still exploring, but he doesn't really know, right? That what is his attitude towards his relationship? That now that he's getting married, this woman is matzah or is she motzeh? On top of that, and this is what Michael pointed out, what comes after matzah, right? What is the groom looking for in his spouse? And this is a really profound point, psychologically, right? Is he looking for isha, or is he looking for ani? Right? Like when you're is a person looking for another version of himself, or looking for the attributes of himself in his spouse, or is he looking for someone that can make him better, perhaps challenge him? Maybe there's differences in his wife, but those can be to complement his flaws. Right? What is his perspective in terms of who when he's going into the marriage? How does he view that relationship? Is he looking for just another version of himself, or thinking that he is good enough and that she has to kind of be like him? Or is he looking for isha, right? He's looking for someone else. And if his mentality is matzah isha, he's looking for someone to complete him, matzah tov. Not because the woman is good, but because his attitude of the marriage is a healthy one, and so he will find it to be a happy marriage, right? That if he's looking for isha, he's looking for the woman who's going to complement him, not looking for himself, then he will find happiness in his marriage. He'll find that he'll want to give, he'll want to do things for her instead of just for himself. Versus motze ani, right? He's really looking for, okay, he got married, but he's looking for him, for himself. So then he'll end up finding mar mimavet. His relationship will be bitter. It will be filled with strife and anger and argument. Because really each person is just all about themselves. They're not about the other person. They're not into giving, they're into receiving. And so that's another layer perhaps of the idea of what matzah or motzeh is really about. Right? What is your perspective coming into the marriage? And then the third thing is, we saw the Maharsha had a different interpretation of this, is that we says this one is ha-isha and this one is just isha. Right? And the way we can understand this is that motzeh, the bad one, is ha-isha. It's like the wife, right? That if you think that there's always jokes, there's jokes that men will make in like a boys' club kind of sense or forum of the missus is not letting me do this, right? The wife, she's not letting me do X, Y, Z. And then you're kind of referring to as ha-isha, she's the wife, right? That she's separate from you and you're married, but she's the wife. Versus matzah isha, again, that it's more that you see it as part of a whole, your unit, and that you're inseparable from one another, and that she fulfills you and completes you, and that will lead you to find matzah tov versus mar mimavet. So just to kind of tie it back to what we saw before, at the end here, and with this we'll close. So we said, right, that a person should be yichaber ishto banav yoter mima sheyesh lo, shehen tluin bo v'tului b'mishamar v'alam. That a person should honor his wife more than himself, right? And this is a famous idea that there's a lot of other midrashim actually in our sugya and Yevamot that talk about this, that a person should honor his wife more than himself. and he should respect her more than himself and do things for her before he do them to himself, which is a challenge, but ultimately that's what leads to matzah tov. That if he puts his wife before, and obviously it goes vice versa, of course, the wife should do that for the husband as well. But if both sides are putting the other side before themselves, then that can lead to a happy marriage, versus each side kind of having their own expectations and thinking that they're the best and that their needs come first. That can lead to more bitterness than death. And then just to kind of maybe tie it to this one last point, which is what Ginsburg makes, a nice drasha on this Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. As we said before, the first time the root matzah comes up in the Torah is by Ule'adam lo matzah ezer kenegdo. That the ultimate paradigmatic idea of finding is finding a spouse, and that first time that matzah comes up is around the wife, and so that could be in the sense a kol alecha rosh, that every idea of finding goes after the first finding, the rosh, the first time that it comes up, which is around the concept of finding a wife. And then we see that the language of the Rif, of you have two paths before you, the good path and the bad path, kind of works nicely with what Rav Reuven says here, albeit in a very different context. That if you have the Ro'eh going and on the Derech Yeshara, on the right path, so then the Tzon will follow. And if you have it the other way around, then the Tzon will follow. So that also ties back to the idea of the husband ultimately in a marriage, right, each person's attitude and what they bring to the relationship can affect their spouse's response, right? It's reactive as well. Like if you treat your spouse b'derech yeshara, so then she will respond in kind, and vice versa. If the woman treats the husband b'derech yeshara, then the husband will respond in kind, because akol alecha harosh, when you are in a mind frame of matzah, then you will matzah tov, but you have to choose the derech yeshara. You have to choose the path of matzah, not the path of motze. Ad kan.
Koyach.